Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this, the closing plenary session of our 2022 Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Summit. My name is Jeff Garris. I am the Federal Campaigns and Outreach Director here at PBPC. 3 weeks ago, we started this budget summit. This is actually the third year in a row that we have been doing this virtually. I'm not going to say hopefully the last, but hopefully the last. Hopefully we'll be able to be in person together next year for our budget summit. But we've had some tremendous opportunities to hear from a variety of experts in policy as well as advocacy over the last 3 weeks. First week, we started off with an opening plenary of our budget analysis, followed by a keynote speech from Senator Vincent Hughes. It was really inspiring. The last 3 Thursdays in the afternoon, we've been having workshop sessions, 2 each week. All 6 of those workshop sessions and the materials from them, the recordings of the opening plenary session, and those materials will all be available on the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center website very shortly, the next day or so, where you can go there, and if you missed anything, you can follow up and pick up some of the additional resources from that. Today, we're really excited to have a tremendous closing session that's going to be a legislative panel discussion featuring some of the key champions for the people of Pennsylvania in the House of Representatives here in Harrisburg. We are really excited to have joining us again, bringing her talents, her expertise, and her experience to the role of moderator, our friend and ally, Corinna Wilson. Corinna is the founder of Wilson 500. She is a lawyer, a lobbyist, a veteran advocate, an intensely insightful communicator, and a TV personality as well. We're really pleased to have Corinna here with us. Some of you may know her as well from the Capitol All-Stars game, which she hosts every year, bringing together members of both parties and both chambers in a softball game that's so far raised more than $250,000 to fight hunger in Pennsylvania. So kudos to you, Corinna, for that. I'm going to turn it over to you and allow you to introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to, I wish also that we were together in person, but I see around the screen a lot of familiar faces. So it's nice to see everybody again. This is, I can't even count how many years I've been doing this, but it's one of my favorite events. So thank you for having me. I'm just going to quickly introduce the panelists, our state representatives, and allow them in their introductory comments to tell you a little bit more about themselves and about their priorities and so forth. But just to remind you, put your questions in the chat and I'll make sure to ask them. This is your time, so we'll make sure to maximize. We'll probably wrap up questions at 3:25, so put them in early and we'll make sure we get to them. We're going to give each of the panelists 3 minutes to make introductory comments, and I'll time them on that. So if you see me go like this, it means wrap it up. And that's it for my housekeeping. But again, please make sure to post your questions. So with us today, we're actually waiting right now for Representative Burgos, Danilo Burgos. He is getting on shortly, we hope, and I'll make sure when I see him to maybe stop and allow him to say hello and give him his 3 minutes. But until that time, we have with us today Representative Mike Schultzberg, who's from the 132nd House District in the Lehigh Valley. And he's also the Democratic Caucus Administrator, so part of leadership in the Democratic Caucus. We have with us Representative Jennifer Omara from the Delaware County in the 165th District. And we have with us also Representative Sarah Innamorato from the 21st in Allegheny County. And again, I'll introduce Representative Burgos when he comes on board. So with that, I will, I guess we'll do seniority first. So we'll let Representative Schultzberg go first for his 3 minutes, and I'll make sure I jump in if you go too long, Mike.
Rest assured I won't. Thank you very much for the introduction. And let me start by noting something that's fundamentally very strange. I don't feel like I should be the most senior member on this call, but here I am. And I will say that it speaks volumes about the relative youth of, I think, the House Democratic Caucus. It was 2 years ago that our former leader, Frank Dermody, began his opening day session by noting that 50% of House Democrats had 6 years or less of experience. And while there's a lot of negatives with that, certainly, there's also a lot of positives. And I think the newer members are bringing a lot of youth and energy and a different experience to the legislature. And that's something that we absolutely need. That being said, again, thank you for the honor of being here today. My name is Mike Schultzberg. I serve the people of Allentown and South Whitehall Township in Lehigh County, hopefully soon Upper Macungie as well, in the 132nd District. My interests in particular are education and mental health. As part of my advocacy, I've worked extensively on trying to fund poor school districts in Pennsylvania. In last year's budget, we had a lot of success with our Level Up funding plan that steered $100 million to the 100 poorest school districts in Pennsylvania. It was a big win, but it wasn't nearly enough for what our school districts need, because we have the largest gap in the entire United States between the richest school districts and the poorest school districts. There's also a lot of work we need to do, in my opinion, on the other most important issue to me, and that's mental health. We know that 1 in 5 Americans actively suffer from some sort of mental illness. We know that huge gaps remain between people who have resources and don't, and even those who do have insurance coverage and access will often struggle to get mental health care because there simply aren't enough professionals. As part of my role there, I formed the House Mental Health Caucus, which is a group of legislators that seeks to address mental health and suicide-related issues. I'm pleased to say we've had some success there. We need a lot more work, and I'll be sure to talk about that shortly. And rather than risk getting hit with the mute button, I'm going to hit my own. Looking forward to talking, folks.
Thank you so much. You're so quick. All right, how about Representative Morano, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Morano. I'm coming to you from my office here in Pittsburgh. And I think when we talk about policy, in policymaking, we need to talk about a combination of the head and the heart. And a lot of these sessions have been about the head, the statistics. There was a really great session last week around housing. So I recommend clicking on the link that's in the chat and watching that. But I want to talk about housing through my lived experience and why it is an extremely important policy issue that I work on. So I've talked a lot about when I was growing up in the greater Pittsburgh region that I had a parent who had a substance use disorder, and what goes along with that and the impact that has on families. One of the key defining moments in my teenage years was I showed up, I got off the bus one day and my mom had a car packed and she was like, get in, we gotta go. And that kind of set off a chain reaction of us having to move from place to place and really experiencing a lot of housing instability through my very formidable years. And that has stuck with me, the precarity of housing, even when by all intents and purposes, you have everything set up and things look great. And then, so it was really important for me to own a home in a community where I felt connected, where I felt safe, and where I had friends and family connections. So I moved to a neighborhood called Lawrenceville outside of, after I graduated from college. And I was able to afford a little row home on my nonprofit salary. And, you know, it's a place that means so much to me. But over the short time that I've lived here relatively for the last 10 years, we've seen housing prices triple. And that has led to the gentrification and displacement of many longtime residents. And now here in our district office, which is also located in Lawrenceville, I have people call our office nearly every day who are trying to find supports when it pertains to housing. And I'll tell you what, if you have to listen to an 80-year-old man who's rented in a neighborhood for his entire life, and then his unit goes for sale, and he calls you and he asks you where else he can live in his neighborhood, where he has all his social connections, where he can walk to the grocery store, where he can catch the bus, and be surrounded by the people he knows and he loves. And he asks you where he can live for $200 a month and keep all of those social connections. It's just not possible. And so that's the human piece of all of this. And it's why our office is focusing on housing as our top priority issue.
Thank you. Representative Omara.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jen Omara. I'm a state representative from Delaware County, currently serving in my second term in the Pennsylvania House. And when I got to Harrisburg, I tried really hard to focus on issues that I believed I could advocate on because of my own lived experience. When I was 13, I actually lost my dad to gun suicide. So many of the things that Mike just talked about are very important to me. But one of the issues that was also really important to me because of my lived experience was addressing student debt in Pennsylvania. When I was going to college, I was a first generation college student. I navigated the FAFSA system by myself. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through a state school, Westchester University. And I know now that I would not be here today without my education. I really value education and the opportunities that it gives people, especially people who are entering that realm for the first time. However, I also know it's very expensive and sometimes it's cost prohibitive for people who are first generation college students, or even if they're not, just someone who's struggling financially in their family to actually be able to afford college. When I graduated, I had the average at the time student debt of a Pennsylvania student, which was about $36,000. That average is now higher, closer to $39,000. And we have seen over the last few decades, Pennsylvania investment in higher ed has continued to decrease, and therefore Pennsylvania support through state grants has continued to decrease for students. And so to Mike's point, bringing in younger members allowed us to focus on issues that younger people were dealing with. So I started the Student Debt Caucus along with another young member from on the other side of the aisle. And while we have yet to get legislation passed, we are working on legislation that will address predatory lenders, that will provide more transparency for students, that will also provide more investments to students. And I think it's really important that we do something about this because we need to keep students here in Pennsylvania. We want to see our population grow rather than losing population, which we just did through the census, enough that we're losing a congressional seat. And we have to continue to make sure that education is affordable for people and that we provide those opportunities for success for students from all walks of life all across the Commonwealth.
Thank you for that. Do any of you want to react to anything the others have said before we move on to questions? Rebuttals? Anything like that? Okay. I guess one of the things that I know, the conference organizers are interested in, and I think everybody's interested, given that all of you on this panel are Democrats and you're working in a Republican-controlled House, there's a Republican-controlled Senate, can you give us a sense of what your tactics are? These are the priorities, these are the things you're passionate about. How do we get these things moving along? How do you make progress when you work in the environment that you work in? Talk a little bit about your how you move things forward. And I'll open that up to anybody who wants to jump in of you.
I don't want to keep doing the senior member. Yes.
Yeah, I'll say, I've actually had 2 bills become law. They haven't been on student debt. They've been on other issues, but it's a part of working the system, using the amendment process. I hate to say it, but making deals sometimes, like I'll take my amendment down if you agree to run it. Getting bills to pass through the budget process, like Mike did that with the Level Up. Instead of passing it by itself, you get it a part of the budget code or the fiscal code. And we also really have to work on building relationships with members on the other side of the aisle. And that's something that I see the 3 people on this call, we do that. I mean, we can't make friends with all of them, but there are some that we can find common ground with. And I've also learned to speak their language. And so, I share my own story to gain empathy. But I also try and talk about things in a way that is a fiscal conservative point of view. And sometimes that has more success at catching their attention and helping them realize that, making this investment or working on this issue isn't just going to benefit me and my constituents in a suburban area, but is going to benefit their constituents in rural Pennsylvania just as much. And I think it doesn't happen enough, but that's at least the tactic I've been taking. And also, we do have a Democratic governor. So when all else fails, try to get the governor to champion an issue. And that sometimes has success as well.
I think Jen, I agree with everything she said. The only thing that I want to expand upon a little bit, and this is an area where I've definitely had some success, is as we have conversations about speaking their language and trying to align with their incentives, talking about the mental health universe. One of the things that I have absolutely found is that if you have a conversation with a Republican and you bring up mental health, they go, man, I know. So I have an urban suburban district. My district's going to get a lot more suburban after redistricting. Jen has a relatively suburban district. Sarah has a mostly more urban, a little bit of suburban district as well. We don't have the kind of access struggles that they do in rural areas. I'm blessed in the Lehigh Valley. I can practically hit Lehigh Valley Health Network or St. Luke's Health Network with a tennis ball from my house. But you go to a rural district and you have a conversation about mental health, and they have huge problems because they can't get from point A to point B. They need telehealth. They need transportation options. They need more practitioners. They need better insurance coverage. And again, mental health is much more of a problem on a per capita basis in rural communities than it is in urban and suburban ones for those reasons and a lot of the social determinants of health care and all of that. I mention this because when you have this conversation, from my perspective, with Republicans, if you talk to them about the needs to address rural mental health care, you're appealing to their interests. And yes, there remain cultural and stigma-related barriers, but those are falling. And if you can, nudge, and I don't mean this in a manipulative way, but if you can help your Republican colleagues see that, you can work together on issues. That's something, going back to Level Up, that I mentioned before. So Level Up, again, was $100 million for the 100 poorest school districts in Pennsylvania. Of the top, now, a lot of us may, you reflexively go Reading, Pittsburgh, Allentown, which is certainly true. 3 of the top 10 were Carbon, and Schuylkill County, like deeply rural areas. In fact, the majority of the Level Up school districts were rural and were represented by Republicans. So as we try to push policies in the minority, we have to do so in a way that appeals to the majority. And then the hardest line that we have to face, especially in a Twitter-centric universe, in fact, Jen and I were fighting with Seth Grove on Twitter yesterday, is trying to draw the line between let's find the common ground and do good together and let's fight. And it's a really hard line. You can't always find the balancing act, but it's something that I struggle with on a regular basis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about speaking the language. When we talk about housing, and I talk to my Republican colleagues, mostly in rural areas, it's not necessarily about displacement and gentrification. It's about reducing blight, combating disinvestment, and stabilizing the homes that are already there and the buildings that are already there. And that's why we've seen some success in the public sphere around getting the word out about our whole home repair bill that we have with Senator Sewall, because it is about stabilizing owner-occupied homes, but also helping small mom and pop landlords who own 5 or fewer units. And that's important too, because you can delineate between someone who owns 5 or fewer units and like Wall Street and private equity owning, single family homes and, other, multifamily units, and even manufactured home parks in rural parts of Pennsylvania that people do see that. They do get calls about that at their office. So it is something that they do resonate with and want to address. The other point that I want to make is that success doesn't necessarily mean that a bill you pass has your name on the top, right? It's also about being aware and following what's going on and being able to talk to the people in power to be able to introduce amendments or have someone else introduce an amendment. So when we were looking at rolling out the emergency rental assistance program, there was a number of clauses in that bill that were problematic and were going to make it really hard for communities to distribute those monies. Because I work with a group here in Pittsburgh who really follow that. We were able to talk to the powers that be, get those changes, certain language removed that would allow for the program to be more efficiently distributed. So like, to me, that's a success, that's a win. And then I also think it's about what we prioritize in funding back home. So we have full autonomy over how we run our district offices. So if we choose to do outreach and connect people with the pots of money that get appropriated each budget, we can prioritize projects that have the most positive community impact. And so through the lens of housing, we've been able to advocate for the City of Bridges Community Land Trust to get funding through the fair funding, the Housing Opportunity Fund that we have at the state level, and kind of start to experiment and show proof of concept of some of these different projects that could translate into more universal policies in the future.
Thank you. That was a really interesting comment about directing your constituents to the pots of money that have been appropriated, that's another power that you have, which is very meaningful. Thank you. And again, we urge you, the conference participants here, to post your questions. We'll gladly ask them, but until you do, I'll ask mine. I'm happy to do that too. I'm looking at Mark Steyer up on my screen, and he wrote a really good analysis of the governor's budget and the governor's budget proposal. And the title of it is Flush with Cash. And so I guess the question to the panelists is, how do you feel about this budget proposal? Where is it going? What are you advocating? Are we doing enough? What should the budget look like when it's done? What do you think it will look like when it's done? Pretty wide open set of questions, and for any of you to answer. Representative Omara, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm going to just talk about in terms of student debt and higher education funding. There is a historical increase for PASHE included in this budget. And the goal of the PASHE schools is to take that increase and direct it directly to students. We also have seen the Nellie Bly Scholarship is included again, which is scholarships directly to Pennsylvania students for higher ed. I'm very excited that an initiative I've been working on with Malcolm Kenyatta, the Hunger Free Campus Initiative, is included, which is a $1 million grant to schools to provide more support for students who are dealing with hunger on campus, because we know that once you leave your house when you're 18, a lot of the benefits you may have had don't follow you to college, and food and housing are both two big issues that we deal with on higher ed, in our higher ed institutions. But while I can say, I like that the governor is focusing on these investments, and we clearly have the money to make them, my concern continues to be that the Republican legislature doesn't agree with where he should put the money and would rather store this money for a rainy day than they would spend it today. And I always say it's raining right now. It is actually raining right now where I am, but it's figuratively raining right now across the state as well. And so it's incumbent upon us to really stick together as a caucus and make sure we continue to push for the initiatives we want to see. And I appreciate the governor. Some of us were worried his budget wouldn't go far enough in his last year, and I think he did. He is trying really hard to see some big things happen before he leaves. But to get it across the finish line in this form is going to be a big challenge. And that's something we're going to have to try to work on, both in the House and in the Senate.
Representative Namarata, you want to go?
Sure. I have been disappointed in the administration's focus on housing. I don't think that it's ever been something explicit that they have talked about. With that being said, I feel like the creative proposals that we're creating, like the whole home repair bill And because we had really robust data collection, at least in Allegheny County around the ERAP program, we're able to have a meeting with the governor's office and explain to him why this is a noble investment and should be a top priority when it comes to impacting the quality of lives of the people across Pennsylvania. And his office has been extremely receptive to that, which I'm grateful for. And because there also has been Republican interest, I hope that those are things that are on the table as negotiations get underway. I do have to say there are elements of the budget that I'm really disappointed in, like the focus on lowering the corporate net income tax without the other safeguards in place that would allow us to actually more equitably collect those taxes, and because it's going to make our coffers more bare. And we've seen where austerity has taken us and what it has done to our public systems that were supposed to serve people and catch people during tragedy. And when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how UC failed. We saw how we didn't have housing programs that would keep people in their homes and businesses afloat. So that's a part that I am deeply disappointed in, and would like to see more dialogue and more creative approach on how we can reduce the tax burden on working people while also having a fair tax system.
Representative Schultzberg, any thoughts?
On the two issues that I care the most about, education and mental health, I mean, by and large, I was very happy. The governor's budget is a monstrous investment in K through 12 education. It also does a pretty good job of putting more money into pre-K, into childcare. Could it be more and better? Always. What I will say too, and so this is Governor Wolf's 8th and final budget, is that his budgets are always starting points, right? Like wherever we wind up starting is not anywhere near necessarily where we're actually going to wind up finishing. So for him to start as relatively high as he is, wanting to make so many investments in critical areas, including education, including restoring, I want to say $36 million of the $81 million that was cut a decade ago to human services, that's a big deal. And I'm pleased with that. Again, could it be better and more? Absolutely. But last time I checked, I represent the people of the 132nd district, not the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And the governor has to keep a broad array of considerations in mind. But on the whole, I think I'm pretty pleased. Oop. And also, Corinna, let me just add, I just got a text from Representative Omara. She just lost power. It really is raining on the eastern part of Pennsylvania right now. So she is trying to get back in.
All right, duly noted. Yeah, I started my day in Philadelphia and it was ridiculous weather, so I appreciate that. We'll welcome her when she comes back. But in the meanwhile, actually, we want to say hello to Representative Danilo Burgos, who joined us. So Representative Burgos, if you want to take a few minutes and introduce yourself and talk about your priorities and just say a few words, and then we'll get back to the questions.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for being late. It's been a challenging day, like always. Our priorities are get our after-school programming in line in crime deterrent for our youth and helping them build the knowledge so that they can be ready for sustainable jobs in the future, primarily around the e-sports and and training to be engineers and coders. That's what I'm part of my focusing on for this budget session.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I guess one of the things, we still are seeing the influx of, federal money in the wake of COVID. We see the Recovery Act money coming in. Are we doing enough, in your opinion, for the 4 legislators? Well, I guess the 3 now that Representative Omara's dropped off.
Now I'm back.
Oh, good. All right. Well, welcome back. I would, if we were in person, I would have seen you walk off the stage. It's hard to see in the Zoom room, so apologize. we've had, are we doing enough to leverage that money? Are there things that we can do in Pennsylvania to bring more of that, or do better things with it, or distribute it in places that need it more? How is that playing out in your opinion? Looking at you, Representative in Omara, you had a bridge collapse in Pittsburgh this past year. Are we doing enough with some of the supports we're getting?
I don't know if it's a matter of we're doing enough with the supports that we have, but do we just need more supports, right? Do we just need more infusion of public dollars into programs that help our public sphere? And I think that's kind of where we're at. We have, if you watch the last session we just did, you see how the amount of tax revenue we've collected has actually declined, where there's this public perception of government's out of control, it's blowing up. But really that's the opposite is true. We've laid off a number of public sector workers. We've reduced the amount that we're investing in public programs. So it's a public perception it's a public relations problem. People don't trust the government as much as they used to, right? And progress moves at the speed of trust. And so as representatives, I think, not only do we have a challenge to govern, but to rebuild that trust in our public systems so that people can connect with their government. They do engage civically, but we also need to do a better job of explaining where these monies go and be transparent and accessible.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on the, accessing or doing more with the federal money that's flowing around?
I mean, I think, go ahead, Jen, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's pretty clear that we're not, and if there's anything that unifies House and Senate Democrats almost universally right now, it's that we need to be doing a better job of spending this rainy day money, because as has been said by people louder than me, it is unquestionably raining right now. The trick is that we don't want to fall into a trap of potentially spending money and then walking off of a fiscal cliff. However, this is an incredible opportunity to spend in a way that, one, can address long-term issues that have been even more exacerbated by COVID, and two, can put us better positioned in the future. This is the moment to make investments, and investment in one-time expenditures that we can reap the benefits on for years. There is maybe no greater example than school construction. So I always talk about, anyone who's ever heard me give a speech on education has heard me talk about, it's actually the school that my wife teaches at in Allentown, Harrison Morton Middle School, which was built in 1871, otherwise known as when the Civil War had basically just ended. In the middle of COVID, she's got 30 kids in a classroom, and her HVAC system is an open window that sometimes opens, sometimes the gears get warped and it won't actually push open. This is the moment to replace Harrison Morton Middle School, as well as the countless older middle schools that are lined with lead paint and asbestos throughout the entire Commonwealth. And if we were going to spend that money in any way, making investments in school facilities is the perfect thing to do. However, we can't convince the legislative majority to do the same. And I think that's really one of the sources of frustration that we have right now. Absolutely.
Thank you. Representative Omara, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with what both of my colleagues have said, but we are not using the federal money, I think, even the way it was intended, which was supposed to provide COVID relief from the pandemic. I understand the need to put some aside, like Mike mentioned, not going off of a funding cliff. However, we have small business owners who are still struggling. We have people still struggling to pay debts that they accrued. Schools that are barely able to get by because of all the additional costs they had to spend on virtual or COVID supplies. And I just think it was supposed to be used for COVID relief. And I felt like too many people were left, out of the formula entirely. And so it's wonderful. We have all this money sitting in a bank account, but if we're not using it to actually help people, then I feel like we are not accomplishing what we should be as a government.
Thank you. Representative Burgos, did you have thoughts on that? think I read in my chat that he's driving, so maybe.
Yeah, I'm driving.
All right. So we have a question from a conference participant. Do any of you see any options for increasing tax fairness that are likely to garner Republican support? Anything out there?
I do think we have some work to do in garnering Republican support for what we term tax fairness, but I do see some glimmers of hope. And part of that is in like commenting on the complexity of our tax system, which allows for the biggest corporations with the most money to exploit loopholes so that they decrease their tax liability, while the coffee shop down the street doesn't have that access to resources, so they end up paying proportionally higher amount. So when you talk about that and what that means, and if we can simplify the tax code and therefore collect more revenue in a more fair way, that tends to resonate with our Republican colleagues. There's also conversations around like ending corporate giveaways and how that disrupts a market, and it's not actually in the spirit of free market principles that they claim to espouse. So we have seen some bipartisan support in that kind of narrative lens. And then those have been the key things and where I see the ability to foster a conversation.
Great. Anybody else? The question was, are there tax fairness proposals out there, and how do you see gaining Republican support on that?
I think one of the broader challenges, and the reason why I'm much more pessimistic about this one to something like tax fairness, is that the idea of what actually constitutes tax fairness is so wildly different between what they think versus what we think. And it makes doing actions on this issue very, very challenging. For us, when we think of tax fairness, we think of working and middle-class Pennsylvanians paying less and wealthier Pennsylvanians paying more. For them, I think, when they think of tax fairness, they just think less, period, full stop. Sarah's right. There are those opportunities to agree, and it's one of those strange moments where you get more progressive legislators agreeing with more conservative legislators, which actually does happen. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and there have been plenty of, I've worked very successfully with some very conservative legislators who care deeply about suicide prevention, and it makes a difference because they happen to have an interest, and there are those opportunities. However, I'm more pessimistic about it because of the experience that we've had on trying to do things like raise taxes or fight for more progressive taxes, or something as simple as property tax reform. There is perhaps no issue more vexing to the legislature than property tax reform. And how many times have you said, I'm going to lower your property taxes? Well, I don't know if I don't know how many people are watching this on Facebook, but let me just say bluntly, they're full of shit, because you can't lower property taxes. It's not going to happen. You cannot mathematically do so in a way that's politically feasible, because you wind up sending income and sales tax through the roof, and you also wind up screwing a certain group of people, namely people on fixed incomes or renters. And my experience with property tax reduction or removal has kind of helped, for me at least, drive home this idea that we're never going to get to that point because the interests of Pennsylvania legislators are really so disparate.
Yes. Anybody else? Representative Omara or Representative Burgos, if you can hear us.
I kind of agree. I mean, I think Sarah's right. We serve in the finance committee, so we have there are some discussions where you see a tax bill that we don't all disagree with, but overall, I agree with Mike that this is just one where we're speaking two different languages when we talk about tax fairness. And too often we see the Republicans pushing tax fairness for large businesses instead of for residents. And I do think this is going to be a harder one to find common ground on.
Another example of this popped up actually today on the Senate side. But what's going on with the constitutional amendments in the state legislature? Can anyone talk about that? Are we governing by amending the state constitution now?
Which amendment?
Well, I know that I think there's like 16 of them, right? But the one that popped up today was only accepting the redistricting bill for 2 years, not for the 10 years. And put that in the Constitution.
2 years for 10 years. Oh, that was the one. They, as long as Tom Wolf is governor, and perhaps, God willing, when Josh Shapiro becomes governor, this is how they're going to try to govern. They've determined that the Constitution is an escape valve to bipartisan action. And whenever they don't like something, they're going to try a constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, when they removed the emergency declaration the last time, that's where we wound up. So I think that's something we have to fight for the foreseeable future. The bad news is that then forces us to make expensive public fights. The good news, potentially, is that forces us to make expensive public fights, because in so doing, it could backfire. We could wind up educating the public about what these guys are trying to do and put ourselves in a better position to actually govern for real.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, just it's become their tactic to avoid checks and balances. They don't want to have to negotiate with the governor, so they want to bypass him, hopefully one day her, altogether, and go directly to the people. And there's a history in Pennsylvania of ballot questions passing. So I think if we are going to ever defeat this process, we're going to have to do a good job of making sure voters know what is happening and making sure voters understand the question, so they're not phrased in such a way that always makes it sound like a great, shiny, rosy thing, and actually defeat some of these at the ballot. The one positive I will say is recently they tried introducing a constitutional amendment, 2 different ones, judicial gerrymandering and Seth Grove's version of reforming the redistricting commission. And the public outcry was so large, and the press was so uniform in talking about this for what it was, which was blanket attempts to create gerrymandering, both within the House and Senate and at the Supreme Court level, that they didn't have the votes. And neither bill has run. Now that may change before the session ends. But I do think people are finally catching on. And even that emergency declaration ballot question last May, which they put on in a May odd year, primary, which we know is historically low turnout after a presidential election, it just barely passed. And it did pass. So I'm not saying, we did a good job, but if we get that education out there, and if we ensure voter turnout, and if we ensure strong messaging, I think there is a chance to defeat them if they do end up on the ballot.
Thank you. Representative Burgos, I don't want to ignore you. So did you want to weigh in on that?
I apologize. I've been dealing with a local situation. A shootout happened a block away from my office, and it's been pretty hectic afternoon. And as Republicans are playing with constitutional amendments to undermine the Constitution of our great state, we're dealing with the real issues around our city. Here in Philadelphia, and unfortunately, it's happening also all over the state, where crime is up. Our services the quality of services to our communities are down, and then even our educational system is behind when it comes to providing a proper education to our schools because of the lack of proper funding throughout the Commonwealth. And we're unintentionally picking winners and losers based on community zip code. So but I thank for the opportunity of speaking in this forum.
Thank you. And actually, I'll follow up with you, Representative Burgos. Levon asked a good question in the chat that there's been, a lot of talk about the pandemic shutdowns hurting small businesses, but now there doesn't actually seem to be much help for them in recovering from the pandemic. Is there something we can do about that?
Well, it's our legislature consists of Republicans and Democrats. And Republicans, unfortunately, and I hate to point fingers, but they provide a lot of bridge namings and no solutions for problems around issues with our small business owners. As a former small business owner here in the city of Philadelphia, it's been very tough hearing other business owners from around the city and in my district around their concerns and the lack of assistance from our end. And again, the Republican leadership, the Republican-led House of Representatives and the Senate have done very little other than undermine the Constitution of our great state.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on the small business question?
I think that we have some programs that have invested traditionally in small businesses. One is that the Keystone Communities Fund, and that fund used to be upwards of like $55 million or so before 2008, and has been flat funded at around $6 million a year. And that's like a direct investment in our main streets all across Pennsylvania. So, looking at funding programs like that would make a huge impact on revitalizing some of our communities. We also, with, again, pandemic funding, we had the small business loan that was issued by DCED. And, that was like a one-time infusion of capital, but it is something that small businesses really were able to take advantage of if they weren't able to access capital on the private market. So, kind of establishing that as a long-term program, I think would be beneficial to a lot of our truly small and Main Street businesses.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have another question here about the possibilities for unity over solar energy production in PA and of using infrastructure funds to support factories and green jobs. What does it look like from where you sit?
I'm cautiously optimistic, actually, on both of those things. And in fact, there have been Republican efforts to push forward solar. Furthermore, the construction industry is a relatively powerful one in Pennsylvania. It's worth keeping in mind that, things weren't as bad 8 years ago as they were, but the much maligned gas tax was passed by a Republican governor and a Republican General Assembly with Democratic support, certainly, because of the power of the construction industry. And as they get more invested in green jobs, I think you can definitely start to see more and more Republicans support those issues, which, to be honest, again, some of them are really not terrible on. Now, I know that's not exactly, overwhelming praise. Some of them are not terrible, but the truth is that they have not been bad on issues like this, and hopefully will continue to get better. But I do say that with no shortage of caution.
I think the reason I also have a little bit of optimism for solar specifically is actually when you drive up the turnpike from Philadelphia or Delaware County, where I live, to Harrisburg, you see solar farms. And we are such an agricultural state that there's a lot of farmers here who are recognizing that if they have unused land, it's a great place to put a solar farm and to sell the energy that they're producing. So this is one where I think we have some hope, but until we're really out of the control of the oil and gas lobby, or until our leadership, not ours on the Dem side as much as the Republican side, but until that leadership is not so beholden to the oil and gas lobby, it is going to be a harder thing for us to accomplish. But I do think we are moving in the right direction.
Anybody else on that? A question on the minimum wage. So, we all know it's been stuck at $7.25 an hour for over a decade, while many of the states around us have raised theirs, sometimes multiple times. Cost for housing and everything else has gone up. The question is, what should we do about it? And I'm sorry, I can't actually see I want to make sure I ask the question that was asked of us. Sorry, I can't see it. Just a question about the minimum wage. I'm sorry, I can't see it.
Well, Governor Wolf has proposed again an increase to our minimum wage. I believe in his proposal, it'll take it from $7.25 to $12 an hour with incremental increases to $15. The issue that we face, or at least I feel that we face around minimum wage, is twofold. Many of our colleagues in the majority think that the only people who make minimum wage are high school kids at pizza shops. It's a narrative I hear very frequently when we talk about this, but we know that's not the case. We know that there are many people still working minimum wage jobs, and the fact that there are some minimum wage jobs out there keep other wages low. And we know that more women and people of color tend to work these jobs, and they're not all high school kids. Many of these people are adults working more than one job to get by. Right now, the narrative that we hear our colleagues say is that the market has corrected itself, and you can go get a job at McDonald's or at Wendy's or wherever, and you're going to make $15 an hour. And so we don't need to legislate this. We need to let the market do its thing. And we know better than that. While yes, some companies have caught on to increasing wages, not all of them, and we still see workers, especially around childcare, making less than they should, or home healthcare aides, or healthcare workers in general. And so we just have to keep up the pressure, keep up the public outcry to do something about this. And I'm hoping through shame and also through painting that fiscal conservative picture about how raising wages will actually benefit the economy, we can try and accomplish something.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the minimum wage question? We have a minute left, and I guess just out of respect to Representative Burgos with what happened in your district last night, what can we do about the gun violence, and particularly what can we do without exacerbating our over incarceration problem that we have here in the Commonwealth? Well, he's on the phone, so maybe we lost him. Would anyone else like to answer that question?
I mean, if we were able to actually do the things that I think Democrats have proposed along the lines of gun violence, would be in a much better position without touching incarceration. I mean, just expanding background checks alone would save lives. I'd also argue that, I think we fall into a trap sometimes when we have conversations about gun control, because I think too often these conversations are, understandably, of course, but they really get particularly loud in the aftermath of some mass shooting. While those are obviously horrific and show the need for an improved gun system, the majority of gun deaths that occur in Pennsylvania and in the United States aren't homicide, they're actually suicide. The conversation about gun control shifts too often into bans. What they should shift to into violence protection, emergency measures, and improving the mental health care system so that we can stop gun deaths by suicide. And I think we've got to do a better job of linking those two issues together. But it's also a challenge because you need to do so in a way that doesn't perpetuate stigma.
Those are excellent.
I was going to also add that, I think that question is actually linked to the question around minimum wage, right? Because gun violence is an economic justice issue, right? It thrives in communities that have been chronically cut off from resources and disinvested in, and don't have adequate access to opportunities and to good paying jobs, into quality schools and out of school time. And so when we talk about addressing gun violence, we need to talk about how we not only design programs and maybe think about something through a regulatory lens, but I think more importantly is how to invest in these communities and the people in those communities, so that we can actually ensure that, every corner of the Commonwealth is a safe, stable, productive place and healthy place to thrive.
Thank you for that. And with that, we are out of time. So I want to thank everyone who invited me here today in any event. And thank you all for being with us today. But thank Lavana and Stephanie Frank and Jeff and Mark and all the folks at the Budget and Policy Center. And now I'll toss it back to Mark. And very big thanks to our panelists today. They did a terrific job.
Great. Thanks, Corinna. Thanks for doing a wonderful job moderating the panel in very different settings than we've had in the past. I hope we'll see you in person next year. It's really exciting to see so many less senior and younger members of the General Assembly, and those are actually two different things, particularly since they're so thoughtful, so well-informed, so frankly progressive, so concerned about how too often class, race, and gender creates barriers, not just for individuals and families trying to get ahead, but for lifting up our economy and creating a better Pennsylvania for all of us. It's so great to hear all the good ideas they advanced today and the initiatives they are taking to make them a reality in our General Assembly under very difficult political circumstances, which we frankly have to acknowledge. We could have invited another 6 or 12 or 18 less senior members. And of course, there's some senior members as well who stand in the same place these members do and who are very welcoming of them and who are as excited as I am to see their bringing new energy to the General Assembly. I also want to thank all of you for attending this panel and this whole summit. The summit's been devoted to two things. The theme was democracy. We know there's serious threats to our democracy in the state, from constitutional amendments that would weaken our checks and balances, undermine our representative democracy, including doing an unprecedented mid-decade redistricting that would overturn the first fair districts we've seen in this Commonwealth in 2 decades for our legislature. It's not an accident that we're seeing these proposals. It's part of the big lie about the 2020 election. It's part of fear of what might happen in the state if we actually did have elections running under fair districts. We've also seen that there are threats to working people in the middle class. We've talked today about using our ARP money to help those who are still suffering from the pandemic and to deal with the problems of inflation that are resulting from the rapid economic recovery, which is largely the result of President Biden's American Rescue Plan. And there are deep long-term problems that we've addressed today: education, higher education, mental health, housing, and others. All these are connected. We need to revitalize our democracy to address our economic issues. After all the panels over the last 4 weeks, and particularly this one just now, I'm a little bit more optimistic that we can revitalize our democracy, that we can work together to create a world in which the rights and dignity of every Pennsylvanian is protected, not just in our politics, but in our economic life. And that as a result, we can overcome some of the divisions in our society and move forward together and lift everyone up and create a better life for every Pennsylvanian. It's sometimes hard to be optimistic in times like these, but when I see these less senior young members of the General Assembly and many others, and I see all of you attending, I get a little bit more optimistic, and I think we have some potential that we can realize working together over the next couple of years. So thank you all for joining us next year in Harrisburg. Let's hope. Take care.